On the ridges and in the rotting jungle of Guadalcanal, in the first weeks of 1943, the soldiers of one of the finest armies on earth were starving to death. They were the men of the Japanese 17th Army, veterans of conquests that had swept from China to the very edge of Australia, and they were dying by the thousand without the enemy ever having to beat them. They had not, for the most part, been broken in battle. In many of their firefights they had held their ground and made the Americans pay for every yard. Out in the dark water to the north, the water the Americans had started to call Iron Bottom Sound, the Imperial Japanese Navy still ruled the night, sailing in after sunset to sink American ships and slipping away again before dawn. By every measure these men had been trained to understand their side was not losing. And yet they were wasting away in the mud, their rifles clean, their discipline intact, and their bodies collapsing from within. They were not dying from bullets or from shells. They were dying of hunger and disease. Ribs pressed against skin gone yellow with jaundice and malaria. Rations had run out weeks before, and men had been reduced to boiling grass, stripping bark, and chewing leather. Dysentery finished what starvation began. The Japanese soldiers had a bitter name for this place by now. They no longer called it Guadalcanal. They called it Gato, which meant Starvation Island, and the diaries later recovered from the dead told, over and over, the same story. It was not the story of an army beaten in the field. It was the story of an army that had been cut off and left to starve while it was still, by its own reckoning, winning. It is a strange thing for a winning army to record. Those soldiers were not claiming that the Americans had beaten them in the field. They were describing something stranger and more disturbing, that the enemy had found a way to destroy them that had almost nothing to do with defeating them in battle. Their courage, their training, and their tactical success were all real and all beside the point, because they were being erased by a process they could not see, could not fight, and could not even properly name. 6 months earlier, the army they belonged to had swept across the Pacific and the whole of Southeast Asia in a campaign of conquest so fast and so complete that Western observers compared it to a natural disaster. That army had taken Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and a chain of islands stretching almost to Australia. It had brushed aside every force sent against it. So how does an army like that, fighting the same way, led by the same officers, equipped with the same weapons, end up starving to death on a jungle island in half a year? And why does it matter that this particular island, Guadalcanal, and not some more famous battle, is where the dying truly began? The answer has almost nothing to do with the things the popular story emphasizes. It is not that American soldiers were braver, because the Japanese soldier on Guadalcanal was as brave as any human being who has ever gone to war, and often braver than was good for him. It is not that Japan simply ran out of ships, because in several of the sea battles fought off this island, Japan sank more American ships than it lost. It is not even that the Americans outfought the Japanese in the jungle, because in many of the actions on Guadalcanal, the fighting was close and bloody, and the outcome hung by a thread. The real answer lies in a question that almost no one in the Japanese High Command had seriously asked before the war began, and that the American war machine was built, almost by accident, to answer. The question is this: what if the decisive weapon of the whole war was not a battleship, or a carrier, or a fighter plane, but the plain, unglamorous capacity to replace all of them faster than the enemy could destroy them? What if the side that wins is not the side that wins the battles, but the side that can afford to lose them? To understand why that question was so deadly, you have to first take the Japanese military of 1942 completely seriously. Because it is the easiest thing in this story to underestimate. This was, in that year, arguably the most effective fighting force in the world at the things it had trained to do. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent 2 decades preparing for one specific event. It called that event the decisive battle. The idea was drawn partly from Japan's own history, from the crushing naval victory over the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905, a battle so total that it ended a war in an afternoon. Japanese naval doctrine was built around the belief that a future war against the United States would be decided the same way, in one great clash of battle fleets somewhere in the Western Pacific, and that everything, every ship, every tactic, every training regime, should be optimized to win that single hammer blow. And within that framework, they built extraordinary tools. Japanese naval crews trained relentlessly for night action, at a time when most navies considered fighting in the dark too dangerous and too chaotic to attempt. They drilled at night until they could execute complex torpedo attacks by starlight that other navies could barely imagine. They developed a torpedo, the type designated 93, that the Americans would later nickname the Long Lance. It was powered by pure oxygen instead of compressed air, which gave it a range and a speed and a warhead weight that no Allied torpedo could match, and it left almost no wake to warn its target. Japanese naval aviators were the elite of the elite. Their training was so demanding and so selective that only a tiny handful of candidates ever earned their wings, and those who did were among the finest pilots on Earth. The men who flew from Japanese carriers at the start of the war had, on average, hundreds of hours in the air, and many had real combat experience over China. The fighter they flew, the Zero, could outturn and outrange anything the Allies could put against it in the first year of the war. The Japanese soldier was cut from the same cloth. He was trained to a standard of physical endurance and battlefield aggression that shocked his enemies. He was taught that surrender was the ultimate disgrace, that the attack was almost always the correct answer, and that willpower could overcome material disadvantage. In the opening months of the war, this produced results that looked like sorcery. Japanese infantry moved through jungle that the British had declared impassable. They advanced on bicycles down the Malayan Peninsula and captured a fortress at Singapore, defended by a force larger than their own. By the middle of 1942, this army and this navy had built an empire that stretched across a third of the globe, and they had done it in about half a year, at a cost that by the brutal accounting of war was remarkably small. If you had surveyed the world's military professionals in the summer of 1942 and asked them which armed force was the most dangerous on the planet, a great many of them would have pointed at Japan. And yet one man near the very top of that navy had already looked past the run of victories and seen the shape of the disaster to come. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had spent time in the United States as a young officer. He had seen its factories, its oil fields, and its endless capacity to build. Before the war, he warned his own government that if he were ordered to fight the Americans, he could run wild for the first 6 months or a year and win victory after victory. But he added that he had absolutely no confidence in what would happen if the war dragged into its second and third years. He was not predicting defeat in battle, he was predicting something worse, a war that Japan could not win fast enough to survive. Guadalcanal would begin at almost exactly the 6-month mark of that prophecy, and it would prove him right in every particular. The reason the fighting came to this specific island is worth understanding, because it explains the entire logic of the campaign. Guadalcanal sits in the Solomon Islands, and in the middle of 1942, the Japanese began building an airstrip there. From that airstrip, land-based bombers could reach the sea lanes that connected the United States to Australia. If those lanes were cut, Australia could be isolated, and the entire Allied position in the Southwest Pacific would be in danger of collapse. Australian coast watchers, lonely men with radios hidden in the jungle across the islands, reported the airfield taking shape. The American High Command understood at once that it could not be allowed to be finished under Japanese control. And so, in great haste and with painfully thin resources, the United States launched its very first ground offensive of the entire war. The operation was officially named Watchtower. The men who took part in it, short of supplies, short of shipping, and short of information, gave it a bitter nickname of their own. They called it Operation Shoestring. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division landed and seized the half-finished airstrip. Holding it would take 6 months and cost more lives than anyone in that hopeful, underfunded operation could have imagined. If stories like this one matter to you, the real machinery of how wars are won and lost beneath the famous headlines, then consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this kind of detailed history reach the people who care about getting it right. Now watch the Japanese war machine do its work at sea, because for the first weeks and months, it worked exactly as designed. On the night of August 8, 1942, only one day after the Marines had landed, a Japanese cruiser force under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa came racing down through the islands in the dark. The Allied ships guarding the invasion beaches were tired, poorly coordinated, and utterly unprepared for the kind of night fighting the Japanese had perfected. What followed, the Battle of Savo Island, was one of the worst defeats in the history of the United States Navy. In a matter of minutes, Japanese gunnery and those oxygen torpedoes tore the Allied screen apart. 4 heavy cruisers were sunk. The American ships Quincy, Vincennes, and Astoria went to the bottom, and so did the Australian cruiser Canberra. More than 1,000 Allied sailors died in the water that night. Japanese losses in the battle itself were trivial by comparison, although one of their own heavy cruisers, the Kako, was torpedoed and sunk by an American submarine the very next day as the victorious force withdrew. Mikawa had won a crushing tactical victory, and he sailed away having demonstrated, beyond any argument, that ship for ship and crew for crew, the Japanese Navy at night was the most dangerous surface force afloat. That victory was not a fluke, and the sound off Guadalcanal proved it again and again over the following months. Not every clash went Japan's way. In late August, at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, American carrier planes sank the light carrier Ryujo and turned back a convoy of reinforcements bound for the island. A genuine American success. In October, at the Battle of Cape Esperance, an American cruiser force under Rear Admiral Norman Scott surprised the Japanese for once at their own night game and sank a heavy cruiser and a destroyer, restoring a little of the confidence that Savo had shattered. But these were the exceptions, and even in victory, the Americans were often outfought at the tactical level. Late in October, at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, Japanese carrier planes sank the American carrier Hornet and damaged the carrier Enterprise so badly that, for a short and frightening period, the United States had not a single undamaged fleet carrier left in the entire Pacific Ocean. That is worth sitting with for a moment. The battered Enterprise, hastily patched and still carrying her repair crews, was for a few weeks the only fleet carrier the greatest naval power on Earth could put into the theater that mattered most. And on the last night of November, at the Battle of Tassafaronga, the Japanese delivered perhaps the purest demonstration of their tactical mastery in the whole campaign. A force of just 8 Japanese destroyers under Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, running supplies to the island, was ambushed by a stronger American cruiser force that held every advantage, including radar. Tanaka's men, using those long lance torpedoes with breathtaking skill, sank the American heavy cruiser Northampton and blew the bows off 3 more American heavy cruisers, crippling them, while losing only a single destroyer of their own. It was very nearly a perfect tactical victory, delivered by an outnumbered force against an enemy who thought he held all the cards. So the record at sea is not in dispute. In the discrete, measurable clashes of ships against ships in the waters around this island, the Japanese Navy was frequently the winner, and sometimes the overwhelming winner. So many warships from both sides were sunk in that stretch of water that the sailors renamed it. Iron Bottom Sound, they called it, for the steel hulls layered on its floor. If you judged the naval campaign the way the Japanese had been trained to judge a naval campaign, by the tally of enemy ships sent to the bottom in battle, then Japan had a very strong claim to be winning it. And here is where we have to confront the thing that almost everyone gets wrong about this campaign, which is why it receives so much less attention than it deserves. Most people who know anything about the Pacific War know the name Midway. Midway, fought in June of 1942, 2 months before the Guadalcanal landings, is the battle enshrined in the popular memory as the turning point of the Pacific. And Midway was indeed a stunning American victory. In a single morning, American dive bombers sank 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the very same carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, and in doing so, they ended Japan's run of unbroken naval dominance. It is a magnificent and genuinely important battle, and nothing said here takes anything away from it. But Midway did not end Japan's ability to attack. In the weeks and months after Midway, the Japanese army was still pushing forward in New Guinea, driving over the Owen Stanley Mountains toward Port Moresby, still very much on the offensive. Midway was a single, spectacular day. It bloodied Japan, and it restored a rough balance at sea, but it did not, by itself, reverse the direction of the war. What reversed the direction of the war was not a day, it was a grind. It was 6 months of continuous, exhausting, three-dimensional combat, on and around one island, a campaign in which the fighting never really stopped, on land, at sea, and in the air, all at once, week after week after week. Midway was the shock, Guadalcanal was the wound that would not close. And to see why that distinction is the whole story, you have to look at the object every one of those battles was ultimately being fought over. That object was the airstrip. When the Marines came ashore, they seized the half-finished field the Japanese had been building on the Lunga Plain, and the Americans completed it and named it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator who had been killed leading an attack at Midway 2 months before. That airfield was the hinge on which the entire 6-month campaign turned, and both sides understood it. Whoever controlled Henderson Field controlled the air over the southern Solomons in daylight, and whoever controlled the air in daylight controlled the sea in daylight, because ships without air cover in range of enemy bombers did not survive the daylight hours. The mixed collection of Marine, Navy, and Army pilots who flew from that muddy strip earned a nickname of their own, taken from the code word for the island: Cactus. They were the Cactus Air Force, and they flew worn-out aircraft from a field that was regularly shelled by warships at night, bombed by day, and more than once nearly overrun, in conditions of filth and disease that would have grounded any peacetime air force in the world. Out of that squalor came some of the most celebrated fighting of the war. A Marine captain named Joe Foss, flying from Henderson Field, shot down 26 enemy aircraft in the space of a few months, tying the record an American had set in the previous World War and earning his nation's highest decoration. But the deeper importance of the Cactus Air Force was not the aces it produced. It was one simple, decisive fact. In daylight, the Japanese Navy could not safely come to Guadalcanal. The great night fighting fleet that ruled Iron Bottom Sound after dark had to be gone by dawn, because after dawn, the Cactus Air Force owned the sky above the water. The men on the airfield did not fight blind. Strung out across the islands to the north, the same coast watchers who had first reported the airstrip now served as an early warning net, radioing down the approach of Japanese air raids as they passed overhead. That warning, often the better part of an hour, was priceless. It let the outnumbered Cactus fighters climb to altitude and be waiting above the bombers instead of clawing for height beneath them. It was a small thing, a few men with radios in the jungle, and it was worth a squadron to the defenders. It was also an early glimpse of the American way of fighting this war, a quiet preference for information, coordination, and system over lone heroics. Think about what that did to the Japanese ability to fight the land battle. An army on an island has to be fed. It has to be supplied with ammunition, with medicine, with reinforcements, with heavy equipment, and above all with food. And the only way to deliver those things to Guadalcanal was by sea. But the sea in daylight belonged to the airfield, so the Japanese were forced into a desperate improvisation. They could only run supplies and troops to the island at night, in fast warships, mostly destroyers, that could dash down the channel after dark, throw men and a few crates ashore, and race back out of air range before sunrise. The Americans called this the Tokyo Express. The Japanese called it rat transportation, and the name tells you everything about how they felt about reducing their proud navy to a nocturnal smuggling service. Destroyers are not cargo ships. They have almost no room for supplies. A destroyer crammed with soldiers and a handful of provision drums could not deliver the artillery, the bulk rations, or the reserves that a real land offensive required. Late in the campaign, the Japanese were reduced to lashing supplies into sealed drums and pushing them overboard to float ashore, and most of those drums were lost or destroyed before the starving men could reach them. And so the Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal began, slowly and then rapidly, to starve. The airfield did not just defeat the enemy air force, it severed the enemy army from its food. And the supply runs themselves were a trap that worked in only one direction. Every night the Tokyo Express sailed. It risked destroyers in narrow waters within reach of the airfield and the American ships, and destroyers were exactly the kind of vessel Japan could least afford to lose and least afford to replace. So the very act of keeping the island's garrison barely alive was steadily consuming the fast ships the Navy needed everywhere else in the Pacific. Rear Admiral Tanaka, who ran these missions with grim skill, understood the futility of it better than most of the men above him. He wrote after the war that there was no question Japan's doom was sealed with the closing of the struggle for Guadalcanal, and he had watched that doom being sealed one destroyer, one starving battalion, one wasted night at a time. The island was not merely failing to feed its defenders, it was draining the Navy that tried to reach them. Because Henderson Field was everything, the Japanese poured enormous effort into destroying it, and at one point they very nearly did. On the night of October 13, 1942, the Japanese battleships Kongo and Haruna stood off the coast and fired nearly 900 heavy shells into the airfield and the men around it in a bombardment so violent that the survivors simply called it the bombardment, as if there had never been another. The ground heaved. Aircraft were shredded. Precious aviation fuel went up in towers of flame. By morning, the Cactus Air Force had been reduced to a handful of flyable planes, and for a short time it looked as though the airfield might be finished. And yet within days, the Americans had patched the runway, flown in fuel and replacements, and put fighters back into the sky. Night after night, the Japanese also sent a single harassing aircraft over the field to keep the exhausted men from sleeping, a machine whose unsynchronized engines made a distinctive throbbing drone. The Marines nicknamed it Washing Machine Charlie. The Japanese could damage the airfield. They could terrorize the men who held it. What they could not do was keep it down, because behind it stood a supply line that could replace almost anything that was lost. The Japanese also tried to solve the problem the direct way, by capturing Henderson Field with a ground assault. And here, the pattern that would doom them revealed itself for the first time, because the Japanese ground commanders, schooled in the doctrine of aggression and the supremacy of willpower, consistently attacked before they had gathered the strength to win. In late August, a Japanese officer named Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, commanding an advance detachment of about 900 men, was so confident and so contemptuous of the Americans that he attacked the Marine lines at the Tenaru without waiting for the rest of his force. The Marines had been warned of his approach in part by a local scout, Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza of the Solomon Islands, who had been captured, tortured, and left for dead by the Japanese, and who survived to crawl to the American lines and deliver his warning. Ichiki's men charged into interlocking machine gun fire in the dark. Roughly 800 of the 900 were killed. The detachment was annihilated, and Ichiki himself did not survive the battle. In September, a larger force under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi assaulted a low rise just south of the airfield that would go into history as Edson's Ridge, or Bloody Ridge, defended by Marine raiders under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson. The fighting came within a few hundred yards of the airfield itself. It was, by the admission of the American commander, the closest the Japanese ever came to winning the island. And it failed, at a cost of many hundreds of Japanese dead against a much smaller number of Americans. There was hard fighting, too, out along the Matanikau River to the west of the perimeter, where the two sides grappled repeatedly over the crossings and the ground beyond. In early October, the Marines pushed across the river and caught a Japanese regiment in the open, inflicting heavy losses and disrupting the build-up for the coming offensive. These were not decisive battles in themselves. They were part of the ceaseless, wearing pressure of the campaign, the constant bleeding of men on both sides that never let up for the entire 6 months. But the bleeding meant something very different to each side, and that difference was the whole war in miniature. When an American unit was chewed up along the Matanikau, it could be pulled back, rested, reinforced, and returned to the line. When a Japanese unit was chewed up, it stayed chewed up. It is worth pausing on what those months were actually like for the men who lived them, on both sides, because the statistics can numb you to it. Guadalcanal was rain and mud and heat that rotted clothing off the body and turned every scratch septic. It was nights broken by the drone of aircraft and the crash of naval gunfire walking across the perimeter. It was the smell of the dead in the wet heat, food that ran short and then ran strange, and an enemy who might come screaming out of the tree line in the dark at any hour. The Americans endured all of it inside a shrinking bubble of relative plenty, resupplied and reinforced from the sea. The Japanese endured the same green hell while that bubble slowly closed around them and cut them off from everything. The raw physical ordeal, the sheer misery of the place, was shared, and it ground down the strongest men either nation could put ashore. This was not the clean, decisive clash of the war Japan had planned for. It was a slow, filthy, 6-month test of which side could keep more men alive and fighting in the jungle, and that was a test of supply, not of spirit. By this point, the strain of the campaign was reaching all the way up the American chain of command. In the middle of October, with the situation on the island looking grim and the naval losses mounting, the overall American commander in the South Pacific, Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, who had grown deeply pessimistic about whether Guadalcanal could be held at all, was relieved of his post. In his place came Vice Admiral William Halsey, a fighter by temperament, who believed the island could and must be held, and whose arrival lifted the morale of the exhausted men on Guadalcanal almost overnight. It was a small human episode inside a vast campaign, but it captured something essential. The Americans were prepared to keep feeding men, ships, and aircraft into this fight until they won it, and to change the men at the top rather than give up the ground. In late October came the largest Japanese attempt of all. The Japanese committed the Sendai Division, the 2nd Division, under Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama, in a grueling march through the jungle to strike the airfield from the south. Thousands of men hauled themselves and their weapons through terrain so dense that they abandoned much of their artillery along the way and arrived exhausted and hungry before the battle even began. When they attacked the Marine and Army lines over the nights of October 23 to 26, they attacked into prepared positions, in the rain, in fragments, and they were slaughtered. More than 1,500 Japanese soldiers died in those few nights, against a defending force that lost a tiny fraction of that number. It was in this fighting that a Marine sergeant named John Basilone held a section of the line with his machine guns through a night of repeated assaults, an action for which he received his country's highest decoration. Now stand inside the Japanese experience of all this, because it is genuinely bewildering from the inside. These soldiers had been told, correctly, that they belonged to the finest infantry in the world. They attacked with a ferocity that unnerved their enemies, and they kept losing, not because they lacked courage, but because they were being asked to storm a fortified airfield across open ground, on empty stomachs, without the artillery and supply that the airfield itself had cut off. The very thing they were trying to capture was the thing strangling them before they could capture it. Their bravery was real, their tactical skill was real, and it did not matter, because the framework they were fighting inside had already been quietly rearranged so that bravery and tactical skill were no longer the deciding factors. This is the turn in the whole story, the thing neither the starving men in the jungle nor their commanders in the rear fully grasped while it was happening. The Americans were not trying to win the campaign the way the Japanese understood winning. They were not seeking a decisive battle. They had stumbled, through a mix of doctrine and sheer industrial character, into a completely different theory of how to destroy an enemy. And it is worth going back a step to see where that theory came from, because it did not appear at Guadalcanal by magic. It came from the deep structure of what the United States was as a nation. The America that fought this campaign was, above almost everything else, an industrial society of unprecedented scale, and its instinct in war, The instinct that ran from its factories to its admirals was to treat combat as a problem of production and replacement rather than a problem of heroism. Where Japanese doctrine sought the single knockout blow, American practice, without ever fully articulating it as a philosophy, aimed to build a machine that could absorb losses indefinitely and keep grinding forward. The United States did not need to win every battle. It needed only to make every battle expensive enough that the exchange, over time, bankrupted the other side. And crucially, it had begun building the tools for exactly that kind of war before it had even entered the fighting. In the summer of 1940, more than a year before Pearl Harbor, the United States Congress passed what became known as the Two-Ocean Navy Act, a single piece of legislation that authorized an enormous expansion of the fleet, enough new warships to fight in the Atlantic and the Pacific at the same time. When the war came, that authorization was already turning into steel. Behind it lay a civilian economy of a size the world had never seen, an economy that could convert automobile plants into aircraft factories and shipyards into assembly lines for warships, and could do it while still feeding and supplying everyone at home. This was the true origin of the capacity that would strangle the starving men on Guadalcanal. Not a secret weapon, not a stroke of genius, a continent that had decided to build. Consider the raw shape of that capacity, because the numbers are almost difficult to believe. In late December of 1942, right in the middle of the Guadalcanal fighting, the United States commissioned a new fleet aircraft carrier, the Essex. She was the first of her class, and before the war was over, the United States would build 24 fleet carriers of that single class, backed by 9 more light carriers of another class entering service across 1943, and dozens of smaller escort carriers beyond that. In the same span, from the middle of 1942 to the early part of 1944, Japan managed to commission just 3 fleet carriers, and 2 of those were conversions of ocean liners rather than purpose-built warships. Set those 2 figures beside each other, and you do not have a competition. You have a verdict. When the American carrier fleet had been beaten down to almost nothing after Santa Cruz, that was not a catastrophe for the United States. It was a delay. The replacements were already being welded together in the shipyards. The same brutal asymmetry ran through every category of the war. American shipyards produced destroyers, the very ships being consumed one after another in the night battles off Guadalcanal, at a rate that dwarfed Japanese output by something on the order of 5 or 6 to 1 across the war. The United States operated well over 500 destroyers during the conflict, while Japan built only about 60 new ones, and by the end, roughly half of Japan's destroyers had been sent to the bottom. American yards turned them out faster than any enemy could ever sink them. American factories produced aircraft in numbers that Japanese planners had literally refused to believe when the figures were presented to them before the war, dismissing them as propaganda. And the strain was already showing in Japan's lifelines. By the end of November 1942, the total tonnage of the Japanese merchant fleet, the shipping on which the entire empire and all its far-flung garrisons depended, had fallen to under 6 million tons, already well below where it had begun the war, and it would only keep falling. Japan was consuming ships, planes, fuel, and men faster than it could replace any of them, and the accounting was merciless. To grasp what that truly meant, you have to stop thinking of it as replacement and start thinking of it as multiplication. The United States was not merely patching the holes the Japanese punched in its fleet. It was building, on top of every replacement, an entirely new navy, and then another one behind that. By the time the carriers lost or crippled off Guadalcanal had been made good, the American fleet was not back to where it had started. It was several times larger and still growing. Japan could, with enormous effort, rebuild something close to what it had lost. It could not even conceive of building 4 or 5 times that much at the same time, because the industrial base to do so simply did not exist. And so every battle, won or lost, moved the 2 navies further apart, the American one swelling, the Japanese one shrinking, until the gap between them became a chasm that no amount of tactical brilliance could ever bridge. You could see the same logic playing out on the island itself, in the mud. Once the Americans held Henderson Field, their engineers went to work turning a single fragile strip into a growing complex of airfields, hacking new runways out of the jungle, laying down steel matting, building the fuel dumps and the revetments and the roads that a real airbase needs. The men who did much of this work belonged to the newly formed naval construction battalions, the units the sailors nicknamed the Seabees, and they built under fire, often with rifles stacked within arm's reach. Every improvement to the base meant more aircraft could operate from it, which meant more control of the daylight sea, which meant more strangulation of the Japanese army. The Americans were not just holding the airfield, they were compounding their advantage week by week, turning a desperate foothold into an engine that ran the enemy down. The Japanese, meanwhile, could not even keep their own men fed. And this is the payoff. This is the answer to the puzzle we began with, an army starving to death in the mud while its navy still won battles offshore. Look again at those dying men, and you can finally see what was killing them. They belonged to a system built to win a short, sharp war through the superior quality of its individual parts. The perfect pilot, the perfect torpedo, the perfect infantryman, the unbeatable night action, and every one of those perfect parts was, by its nature, almost impossible to replace. That elite Japanese naval aviator, with his hundreds of flight hours, was the output of a training pipeline so slow and so selective that when he was shot down, and over Guadalcanal they were shot down in a steady, grinding stream, there was simply no one of comparable skill to take his place. One of Japan's greatest aces, Saburo Sakai, was gravely wounded in the fighting over the Solomons in the campaign's very first days, blinded in one eye and taken out of frontline combat for years. He was one man, and he was irreplaceable, and the campaign chewed through men like him month after month. There was a structural cruelty in how Japan used its finest airmen that made all of this worse. The Japanese naval air arm tended to keep its best pilots at the front, flying and fighting until they were killed, rather than rotating them home to teach the next generation. The result was that when a veteran died over Guadalcanal, his skill and his experience died with him, instead of being passed on to hundreds of students. The Americans did close to the opposite, pulling experienced combat pilots out of the line to instruct, so that the hard lessons of the Solomons were multiplied across thousands of new flyers coming up behind them. One system spent its expertise, the other invested it. Over a long war, that difference alone was enough to hollow out Japanese air power from the inside. There was a difference in the air itself, too, in how the two sides actually fought. The Zero could outturn and outclimb the heavier American fighters, and in a contest of pure individual skill, the Japanese pilot usually held the edge. So the Americans changed the contest. A naval aviator named John Thatch had worked out a simple maneuver, a weaving pattern flown by a pair of aircraft covering each other, so that any Zero chasing one American would fly straight into the guns of the second. It came to be called the Thatch weave. It did not require the American to be the better flyer, it required only that two ordinary pilots trust each other and hold their formation. That was the whole American method in miniature. Where the Japanese leaned on the brilliance of the gifted individual, the Americans built tactics and machines and supply chains that let ordinary men beat brilliant ones by working together and by never, ever running out. The full extent of that particular wound is worth stating plainly, because it is the hidden heart of the whole matter. Across the Guadalcanal campaign, Japan lost somewhere in the region of 680 aircraft. The Americans lost a broadly comparable number of airframes, a little over 600. In the crude accounting of machines, it looks close to a draw. But airframes were never the true currency. The true currency was aircrew, and here the historian Richard Frank, whose account of the campaign is the most authoritative ever written, estimates that Japan lost on the order of 1,200 aviators over Guadalcanal, and adds that the real figure may well be higher and has never been fully established. Those 1,200 men were not machines that could be stamped out again on an assembly line. They were the irreplaceable graduates of years of elite training, and when they were gone, the quality of Japanese naval aviation began a decline from which it never recovered for the rest of the war. Nowhere did that difference in what a side could afford to lose show itself more starkly than in the great naval battle fought off the island in the middle of November. Over several nights, the Japanese sent powerful forces down to bombard Henderson Field into rubble and clear the way for a mass landing of reinforcements. The Americans, badly outgunned, threw everything they had left in front of them. In a chaotic, point-blank night action, cruisers and destroyers of both sides fired into one another at ranges so short that gunners could not miss. Two American admirals, Daniel Callahan and Norman Scott, were killed within minutes of each other in the same battle, the only time in the entire war that the United States lost two admirals in a single surface engagement, and both received their nation's highest decoration. One of the American light cruisers, the Juno, was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine as the battered fleet withdrew the next day, and she blew apart and sank with almost her entire crew. Among the dead were 5 brothers from a single family, all named Sullivan, a loss so total that it changed how the American military handled the service of siblings for good. The cost to the United States was appalling, and it was worth it. Over those November nights, the Japanese lost 2 of their battleships, the Hiei and the Kirishima destroyed by the gunfire of the American battleship Washington in a night duel directed by radar. Most of the troop convoy the whole operation had been meant to protect was wrecked before it could land its men. The bombardment failed, the airfield lived, and the Japanese Navy never again seriously attempted to force reinforcements onto Guadalcanal in strength. The Americans had traded ships and admirals and 5 brothers for a strategic result, and unlike the Japanese, they could pay that price and keep fighting. That is the whole thesis of the campaign, compressed into a few terrible nights. The side that could absorb catastrophic losses and continue was the side that won. If you are finding this account valuable, a like helps it reach more viewers, and subscribing means you will not miss the next deep dive into the parts of this war that rarely make it into the standard tellings. And then, in its final months, the campaign revealed its cruelest dimension, the one that stripped the last shred of dignity from the Japanese defeat and exposed the attritional logic in its purest form. The soldiers on Guadalcanal did not, for the most part, die in the glorious decisive battle their doctrine had promised them. They died of hunger and disease, cut off from supply by an airfield they could not take. As the Tokyo Express failed to deliver anything like enough food, the Japanese army on the island simply began to waste away. Men too weak to stand lay in the mud and were consumed by malaria and dysentery and simple starvation. Their own records and the recollections of the survivors describe a scale of suffering that is difficult to read. Of the roughly 30,000 Japanese who died on and around Guadalcanal, historians estimate that only a minority died in actual combat. The majority, by most serious accounts something close to 2/3, died of starvation and disease. One widely cited reckoning puts it at around 15,000 dead from hunger and sickness, against perhaps 5,000 killed in battle. That is the meaning of the name the soldiers gave the place, the Starvation Island. It was not a figure of speech. It would be a mistake to imagine that disease spared the Americans, because it did not. The tropical environment was an enemy to both sides, and the sick lists of the 1st Marine Division tell a grim story of their own. The American Army's own medical accounting for the campaign is almost startling when you read it. Of more than 10,000 casualties recorded in the division up to the 10th of December, only around 1,400 were the result of gunshot wounds. Malaria alone accounted for more than 5,700 cases, and in the single month of November, it sent over 3,000 men to the hospital. Disease, not the enemy, was the largest single drain on American strength on the island. And yet the Americans won, and here is exactly why. The difference, the decisive difference, was not that the Americans did not fall sick. It was that the Americans could evacuate the sick, treat them, feed the healthy, and pour in fresh, fed, medicated replacements by the shipload, because they controlled the daylight sea and the airfield that commanded it. The Japanese soldiers who fell sick had no such lifeline. They stayed where they lay, and they starved, and they died. Same island, same diseases, opposite outcomes, and the reason for the difference was, once again, the capacity to replace and resupply, not the courage of the men. So here is the forensic verdict on the death of those men in the mud, and on the wider death of Japan's hope of winning the war. They did not fail. Their courage did not fail. Their training did not fail. Their navy's night fighting did not fail. And neither did its torpedoes nor its pilots' skill. What failed was the entire theory of war they had been raised inside. It was a theory in which the quality of the warrior, the perfection of the weapon, and the winning of the decisive battle were the things that determined victory. And against most enemies, in most wars, that theory might have held. Against the fully mobilized industrial power of the United States, fighting a war it had chosen to conduct as a problem of production and attrition, that theory was not merely wrong, it was suicidal, because it led Japan to spend its irreplaceable elite, its aces and its veteran crews and its finest infantry, in a contest whose real terms were set by factory output and replacement rates, terms on which Japan could never do anything but lose. The two sides were, in the end, fighting two entirely different wars on the same island. The Japanese were fighting to win battles. The Americans were fighting to make Japan pay a price it could not afford, whether they won the individual battles or not. And the deepest reason Japan could never adapt to this lay in the very structure of its military culture, which prized the initiative and the aggression of the individual commander above almost everything, and which had built its whole strategic imagination around the search for one clean, decisive stroke. That culture produced magnificent tacticians and terrifying assault troops. What it could not produce was a war economy that treated the loss of a carrier, a squadron, or a division as an accounting entry to be corrected in next quarter's production, rather than as a wound to the national spirit. The Americans, almost without meaning to, had made themselves into exactly such a machine. And a machine of that kind does not need to be braver than its enemy. It only needs to outlast him. There is a bitter irony folded into all of this, and it belongs to those beautiful, deadly Japanese instruments of war. They were not bad. They were, many of them, the best in the world. The long lance torpedo remained the finest torpedo of the war long after Guadalcanal was lost. The skill of Japanese night fighting was never truly matched by anyone. That is exactly why Tassafaronga is such a haunting endnote to the campaign. It was fought at the very end of November, when the strategic tide had already turned decisively against Japan, and it was one of the most lopsided tactical victories the Japanese Navy ever won. They were still winning battles even as they lost the war. Their weapons had not let them down. Their idea of what winning meant had. Japan had built a superb instrument for the war it expected to fight, a short war of decisive battles. It had built almost nothing for the war it actually got, a long war of attrition and replacement. The campaign's final naval action carried its own grim echo of everything that had come before. At the very end of January 1943, as the Americans maneuvered warships to cover the island, Japanese torpedo bombers found the heavy cruiser Chicago and sent her to the bottom off Rennell Island. What the Americans did not yet realize was that the Japanese movements they were bracing against were not the opening of a new offensive at all. They were the covering force for a withdrawal. Japan was no longer coming to Guadalcanal. Japan was leaving. We can measure the cost of learning that lesson with some precision. The United States lost roughly 7,100 men killed across all services in the 6 months of the campaign. Japan lost somewhere between 19,000 and 30,000, with the most careful estimates near the upper end of that range, the majority of them not to American bullets, but to hunger and disease. And in the first days of February 1943, in a night operation the Japanese called K, the same navy that had once ruled Iron Bottom Sound, crept back one last time, not to reinforce the island, but to take off the survivors. Just over 10,600 skeletal, disease-ridden men were lifted from Guadalcanal in 3 swift nocturnal runs, an operation so quietly and skillfully executed that the Americans did not even realize the enemy was leaving until he was already gone. That was how Japan's first great campaign of conquest ended. Not with a decisive battle, with an evacuation of the starving in the dark. The men who ran the Japanese war understood, at least in hindsight, exactly what had happened to them, and their own words are the most damning verdict of all. Interrogated after the war, the chief of the Japanese Naval General Staff was asked to name the moment the war turned from the offensive to the defensive. He did not name Midway. He pointed to Guadalcanal, and he explained the reason with the clarity of a man who had watched it happen. The cause of the setback, he said, was the inability to build up Japanese forces on the island at anything like the speed the Americans could. A senior naval planner put it even more starkly, recalling that after Guadalcanal, in the latter part of 1942, he had felt that Japan could no longer win the war. A deputy chief of the Army General Staff agreed that the turning point, the place where forward action ceased, was Guadalcanal. Even Naoki Hoshino, a senior member of the wartime cabinet in Tokyo, took to dividing the story of Japan's war economy into the age before Guadalcanal and the darker age after it. They knew. They had reached, by hard experience, the same conclusion the American war machine had been built to enforce, that the decisive battle they had chased across the Pacific was a mirage, and that the real contest, the one they had already lost, was the one nobody in Tokyo had ever wanted to fight. There is a final grim symmetry to the story. The admiral who had warned his own government that Japan could not win a long war, Isoroku Yamamoto, did not live to see how right he had been. In April 1943, only weeks after the last starving men were lifted off Guadalcanal, American codebreakers read a message giving his flight schedule as he toured the shrinking front in the Solomons. Long-range American fighters were sent to intercept him far out over the jungle, and they shot his aircraft down. The man who had seen the American factories with his own eyes and understood exactly what they meant was himself killed by the reach and the coordination of the very machine he had feared. His death changed nothing about the outcome. The arithmetic he had tried to warn his country about was already running to its conclusion without him, and run to its conclusion it did, in a way that made Guadalcanal the template for everything that followed. The airfield the Marines had bled to hold became the first rung of a ladder. From Henderson Field, American air power reached north up the Solomons, and the Japanese, unwilling to concede the chain, fed air group after air group down into the same grinder that had already swallowed so many of their best. All through 1943, the veteran ranks of Japanese naval aviation were bled white over those islands, dying faster than the training schools at home could ever hope to replace them, exactly as they had begun to die over Guadalcanal. The Americans, meanwhile, grew stronger with every passing month, their new carriers arriving, their new pilots arriving, their new airfields creeping ever closer to Japan. The pattern set on this one island simply repeated itself, larger and larger, all the way across the Pacific. Return one last time to those starving men on Guadalcanal in the first weeks of 1943. Most of them never understood what killed them, because the framework they had trained inside did not contain the possibility of what was happening to them. In their world, a soldier died when a braver or a stronger enemy overcame him in battle. They had not been overcome in battle. They had been calculated out of existence by a system that never needed to defeat them at all, only to cut them off and wait. Their theory of war was heroic and absolute. Be brave enough, and skilled enough, and armed well enough, and you will prevail. The American theory of war was industrial and patient. We will lose ships and planes and men, and it will not matter, because we can replace them faster than you can, and the moment we impose that arithmetic on you, the outcome is already decided, no matter who wins the battles in between. Both theories were internally coherent. Both had produced real victories in the past. Only one of them matched the reality of what a war between an island empire and a continental industrial giant would actually be. Guadalcanal is remembered less vividly than Midway, and less than the great island invasions that came later. But it is where the true nature of the Pacific War first revealed itself in full, over 6 unbroken months of land, sea, and air combat, and where Japan first ran headlong into the one thing its magnificent military had no answer for. Not a braver warrior, not a better weapon, a deeper reserve. The island did not merely cost Japan an army and a fleet's worth of veterans. It taught Japan, in the plainest possible terms, that it had entered a war it had already lost the moment it chose to fight it, as a contest of battles against an enemy who was fighting a contest of production. That lesson, learned on a starvation island in the Solomon Sea, was the true beginning of the end. Everything that came afterward, island by island, all the way to the home waters of Japan itself, was only the working out of an arithmetic that Guadalcanal had already made plain. If this forensic account gave you something to think about, hit the like button and subscribe. It is how histories like this one reach the people who care about understanding the war beneath the headlines.